In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the characteristics and organization of a realistic fiction piece. Now, the first thing I want you to do is get out your writing journal and turn to page 268 in your practice companion books. Now, in your writing journal, what I want you to do is just do a quick write, and I want you to write anything that you know about realistic fiction stories. And these are some things that you need to think of when we begin starting to pick a topic for your realistic fiction piece. So pause the video, we'll go over these things that we already know in class. Now that you have written everything that you know, or some of the things that you know, here's some things that you may know and some things that you need to think about with a realistic fiction story. First of all, some things that you probably know, pretty obvious things. It has a beginning, middle, and end. Also, the fact that it's fiction, it is made up. However, realistic fiction, you can see in that third point, has events and people that seem realistic. Okay, so anything that's happening in a realistic fiction story could actually happen in real life, but it did not. Okay, so in other words, your main character is not going to grow wings and fly off to another city or anything like that, okay, because it's realistic fiction. So some things that you need to think about. First of all, what is your story going to be about? What event will I write about, and who will be my characters? Now, your characters, once again, are made up. They aren't necessarily have done or will do the things that you're going to talk about in your piece either. Now, what I want you to do is turn to page 268 in your practice companion book, and I want you to read our writing model, A Race to the Finish. Now, as you're reading it, or after you're done reading it, I want you to answer these questions in your writing journal. What did you like about the story? Why do you think the author chose to write the story? How can you tell it's realistic fiction? For whom do you think the author wrote it? And also, are these characters like people you might know? So we'll go over these questions in class, and I want you to read through page 268 to show you what a realistic fiction story looks like. So pause the video now. As we continue to try to wrap our minds around a realistic fiction piece, let's take a look at the author's purpose in a realistic fiction piece. So we can see that in realistic fiction, the author's purpose is to entertain the reader by telling a compelling story with lifelike characters. Readers should be able to relate to the characters and believe that events like these could actually happen. So once again, it's realistic in the fact that it could happen, and it's fiction in the fact that it never did happen. So these are some things to think about when you're thinking about the purpose of writing your story. Okay, so some things that you need to think about with a good realistic fiction story, and I do want you to write these down in your notes so you can refer back to them as you're writing your story to make sure that you are including these things. First of all, it's made up by you, the writer. You are not taking any story from another book that you have read, maybe partial ideas or things like that, but you are making this up completely on your own. You want to include characters who think and act like people you may know. That's the easiest way to develop characters. Think of somebody that you may know. Don't even give them the exact name that that person has that you may know, but somebody that kind of reminds you of a certain person is a way to develop some pretty interesting characters. Also, you need to include characters who face a problem that they need to solve. It's very important to have that. You need to have a beginning, middle, and end. Also include events that are told in the order that they'd happen. So very important to write this in sequential order. Okay, so in a time-ordered events. And then also include a setting that is a real place and takes place in modern times. Okay, so we're not doing historical fiction or sci-fi fiction or anything like that, or sci-fi, I should say, science fiction, but this is a realistic fiction. We want to have it take place in our modern times, and also the setting that is an actual real place. So write these tips down in your writing journal so you can refer back to them as we continue to learn about what makes a good realistic fiction story. So it's important to think about, before you begin writing, how a realistic fiction story is organized. Now, it's important to know that it can be organized using a story map, and you'll want to think about these different parts of a story map before you begin writing your piece. So first of all, you want to think about the setting. Now, I used A Race to the Finish to complete this story map. So first of all, the setting of the piece, the night before the school election in Atlanta. Obviously, Atlanta is a real place, so I used a real place for that, or the author used a real place. The characters, you want to list the main characters in your story. Okay, you can see all the characters that I have listed there, and those are the main characters in the story of A Race to the Finish. Also a problem. You want to think about the problem that the characters or main character may have. For example, in this story, Jared needs to get votes for the school election. Now, I will say that this is something that you do before you begin writing, not after, and make sure everything fits. This is before you do, before you begin writing. So the plot or the events that take place in order to solve this problem, you can see is the next part of the story map. Jared talks with his sister. Jared makes a new poster. Okay, so not every single detail here, but some of the main things that the character begins to do to start solving the problem. And then finally, the resolution. So you can see that Jared emails a new poster on the morning of the election. Okay, so these are some, these are the parts of the story that you need to really think through before you begin writing. A setting, characters, the problem, the plot or events, and finally the resolution. Okay, so this is just how a realistic fiction story could be organized. Okay, now when you come to class, this is what you'll be doing. You're going to be going to the ideas section of your writer's notebook, and I want you to start jotting down ideas for your realistic fiction story when you come to class today. Some things that you do need to remember: characters must face a problem, characters must act like people you know, and also the setting is a real place in modern times. So we want to be thinking about that as we come to class today and we start thinking about the topic of our realistic fiction story. So this concludes the video on identifying the characteristics and organization of a realistic fiction story. If you have any questions about this concept, please come and see me.